You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
What we are looking at doing here at the university through the framework is creating that space for Indigenous knowledges to be uplifted and recognized as equal, as a valid form of knowledge and education, and I guess if you're looking at it from a research perspective, I guess a way of creating knowledge itself. And so when you look at that, what are we doing here at the university? So we're really focusing right now on land-based education. So what does that mean? From a pedagogy perspective, we are creating space and tools so that we can use an Indigenous knowledge system to support everyone.
And so when you say that, you would like to think about an institution like a university, like the University of Auckland being Indigenous, isn't to say that it's an Indigenous institution and that's all it is. But for Indigenous communities, it's Indigenous. And for other communities who want to enjoy that, they can enjoy that, but it's also the type of university they want and need, and so on. It's not a zero-sum game.
Hi there, thanks for joining us on this week's Campus podcast with me, Miranda Prynne, editor of Campus, which is Times Higher Education's platform for professional advice for academics and others working in universities.
And with me, Eliza Compton, the deputy editor of Campus.
This week, we have been learning about the work going on in many parts of the world to give greater voice to Indigenous people in higher education. Higher education is a system which has traditionally been largely inaccessible for a lot of Indigenous communities, and in the past has been used to actively stamp out Indigenous knowledge systems. Now, work is underway to address these past wrongs and also address the inequities and systemic barriers that remain, but as we will hear, there is still a very long way to go.
Yeah, there is, but there's so much work being done around the world, and in pulling together our resource collection on campus, which does focus on Indigenous voices in higher education, I found it really interesting to look at the way that the work touches every aspect of university life. So looking at First Nations participation in leadership and student support, as well as research and teaching and learning.
Yeah, and of course, this work needs to start really before higher education. It starts with the schooling system. It needs to take in a whole kind of holistic view. I should also add the historical context and thus the current challenges vary hugely in different parts of the world. And there is a great diversity of First Nations peoples. So for this podcast, we were really keen to get perspectives from different sides of the globe. Eliza, who did you speak to?
Yeah, I think we've literally gone from either side of the globe. I spoke to Tekawe Ho Hoskins, who is a professor in Maori and Indigenous education and philosophy, and the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Maori at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She has just been promoted to full professor, as you'll hear in the interview a bit later, although I did initially introduce her as an associate professor. And it's actually her story about how she came to leadership in higher education is really interesting.
That sounds wonderful. I'm really looking forward to hearing from her. I spoke to Angie Bruce, who is Vice President Indigenous at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Now, Angie is a Red River Métis woman herself and maintains really strong ties with her home community of St. Laurent. Prior to taking up her current post, Angie had extensive experience working with First Nations, Inuit and Métis people in Canada in various public sector organisations. And she actually led the development of an Indigenous research ethics policy for the government's Natural Resources Department. And this has really looked at changing the way that scientists engage and partner with the Indigenous nations across Canada. So she brings a really interesting breadth of knowledge and experience to this topic. Hi, Angie. Wonderful to speak to you.
Hi, Miranda. Thank you. Excited to be here today.
You only took up the post of Vice President Indigenous at the University of Manitoba in February this year. So I wonder what had been your immediate priorities in the role?
So the first thing that I looked at when I took on the role was first to get a foundation of what was already here. So the University of Manitoba has been working around strengthening its relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. That includes students, faculty, staff, as well as community partners around Manitoba and internationally as well. And so I wanted to get a good sense of what was already here in the bases, and what were some of those foundational changes that needed to take place. And so really, I think the first couple months was that learning and understanding the relationship, understanding the mechanism of how the university functions, and then looking at opportunities in terms of where could we make those changes. So within the first couple of months, it became very clear to me that there were different faculties, different administrative units, really taking reconciliation and moving it at different stages and in different ways. And so I really wanted to focus on how could we create a cohesive pathway and understanding of where the institution overall wanted to walk in reconciliation. Where did we want to walk this path with Indigenous people? Where did we feel that we could make the biggest impact based on the expertise that we had, based on the areas that are spheres of influence and where we could make change? And so from that time, we've really been pulling together a framework that guides the principles of how we want to work, a framework that leads us to specific areas in terms of where we want to see connections, where we want to see growth. And so that really was the first part. So looking at it from a student's perspective, so the development of a student ecosystem. So that's understanding how do we work, how do Indigenous students, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students from our first interaction. So looking at it from recruitment, so starting right from the first interactions, what are the needs of students? How do they come to us? What are they looking for from us? And what really supports success? And so from a student perspective, that's really what we wanted to focus on. From a faculty and academic perspective, looking at what are how do we lift up Indigenous knowledges? How do we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in the institution? And so it's really creating the foundational system changes in my role to look at how we can all support that. So I think the first piece was, I'm not the only one who needs to do reconciliation work, or one office is not going to make those changes in how we work with Indigenous people, because we do that in different ways across our institutions. So it was looking at really creating the foundational systems, policies, procedures, changes that we need to do as an institution to allow all of us to walk this path together.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, sort of guiding the process, but then still allowing space for, as you say, different departments, faculties, schools who may well be at different stages or be approaching it in slightly different ways. So for listeners outside of Canada, to give them a broader picture, what are the biggest issues relating to higher education's relationship with Indigenous peoples as a whole at the moment?
So I think there's a number of pieces. Number one, I think it's a colonial institution. So we have to recognize that the system of a university in itself did not allow space for Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous people. To be quite frank, Indigenous people, in order to attend university, in particular First Nations, needed to get permission, and then needed to give up their identity. So the Indian Act, which governed and still governs here in Canada, our relationship from a federal government perspective with First Nations communities, way back when, did not allow. You had to give up your Indigenous identity status, which means you had to leave your community. You were no longer accepted in your community or no longer allowed to be there to attend an institution like a university to gain that higher education. So we're really starting from a system that was made for non-Indigenous people, a system that was created for a colonial, from a colonial perspective, to lift up colonial knowledge and understanding. So it created, I think, a power imbalance between settlers, so the new people who came to this country, and Indigenous people, so First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And so when you have that, you have a system that is, I would suggest, like strict in policy, is created. Actually, the academic system is created on the basis of equality, that everybody must be equal. The issue is when you are not equal to start, how do you ever address that? And how do you ever get lifted up to meet and become equal in the same field? So if you're looking at it from an institutional perspective, plus there's additional barriers within our systems in itself. So financial barriers. Indigenous people have not created wealth. Policies, again, have made it very difficult for wealth generations within our community. Many times, even now, students are, in this day and age, the first generation of their family members coming to an institution. It could also be the first generation of individuals who are leaving in First Nation communities. So many of our First Nation communities are in northern and rural communities, so very far away, very isolated. Potentially here in Manitoba, we have fly-in communities, so you cannot access it through roads. You must fly into those communities. And then we're taking those individuals out of those communities and putting them into a setting like here at the University of Manitoba. We have 30,000 people, 30,000 students. That is the extent. So you're coming from a community that might be 500, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000. And now you are being taken out of a rural setting where you have been engaged in terms of nature and kind of in a different field. And now you're being put into an institutional setting with large buildings, classrooms. You are now asked to transition and conform to how our systems are. And those systems are not being open to how you come. I have a great example, actually, of something that we are transitioning now, and I think it points to a lot of this. So student residence. You come in, you apply for student residence. So for Indigenous students, like are coming in from northern Manitoba or other areas across Canada, you come in, you get just assigned a floor, any floor. So you may be the only Indigenous person on your floor. So you're coming in, you've never been in an area like this. You've never had to live away from home. You've never had to engage. Potentially the food is even different in terms of the food that you consume. And you feel alone. You feel isolated. So one of the things that we actually have done just in the last year is transition to having all of our Indigenous students on one floor within our residence. And it has changed the dynamics. The Indigenous students are interacting, they're engaging, they're creating community. It has changed the outcomes of those students. We're seeing them stay longer, because what happens once you feel isolated is you start disconnecting. Your mental health starts being impacted and you start getting homesick. And what we find is students start leaving after, say, month 2 and potentially into month 1 and then potentially into month 2.
I want to come in here. You've provided a really useful context for anyone listening to this to understand that the barriers to Indigenous involvement in higher education, these reach back, hundreds of years. This is a whole sort of systemic change that needs to happen. But you have also very helpfully touched on some of the more immediate issues around wealth, the system itself coming from schooling, I suspect, upwards, location and kind of cultural isolation. I wanted to ask, because you've pointed very clearly to the fact that then facilitating the building of community, a sense of community, is incredibly helpful. And I felt this was a really good opportunity to actually expand on that student support side. What specifically is really helpful to Indigenous students? And I say that very aware that clearly this is a very diverse group of people, and what is really making a difference? So you've mentioned community. Is there anything else?
Yes, I think there's a number of things. So community absolutely is vital. So what we find is when Indigenous students find community at an institution, they're more likely to stay longer. The other piece is looking at addressing financial barriers. So we talked a bit about the wealth in terms of that. So how are we supporting bursaries, scholarships? How are we alleviating some of those financial pressures that might be there so that they can attend? And so we've worked quite closely with our awards and bursaries. We make it easier so that what we find are navigating the systems of student awards and bursaries can be overwhelming. So you're coming to a new institution, you feel out of place already. You feel like individuals know that you are Indigenous and you don't fit in necessarily. And so navigating and asking for that help can be very challenging. So we've set up an Indigenous Student Center at the University of Manitoba. We find that this is critical. So where they can feel it's a center for themselves, it's got, we have elders, so we bring in elders from different communities to engage, to talk about mental health, to provide that support, to create that home feeling for students when they're here, to help guide them around that financial piece, to guide them through course selection, to support them when they're actually having let's say, challenges in classes with professors, because you also have to understand there's also a power dynamic between a professor and an instructor and a student. So you have a student coming in, and then you're going into a class. In many First Nations communities, the educational system is not at the same level as, say, the urban settings or public systems that we have. And so you're coming in potentially not at the same level. So how are we, again, creating those supports? How are we doing wraparound services to support tutoring, to support like learning objectives, and how students learn are different. And so how are we ensuring that that is available so that students actually have a success pathway? Cultural sensitivities and insensitivities. So what if you're in a class and you hear a professor speak disparagingly about your people, about who you are and where you come from? How does that make you feel? And so I think from our perspective, it's really supporting that education. It's supporting our understanding of stereotypes. It's looking at how we educate and train our professors, our instructors, our staff, our administration on the history, because we haven't learned that. We are just starting the process of understanding the history of Canada from an Indigenous perspective and the impacts of the colonial policies that we've had on Indigenous people. And so I think that that is one place where a university it's so important from an academic setting that we have that support and that we have that understanding. Murray Sinclair, the late Murray Sinclair, quotes this, and I love to quote this: education is what got us in this mess. Education is what's going to get us out. And so for me, we really have an obligation here at the university to look at how are we uplifting, how are we strengthening Indigenous students, because what that then does is those individuals go back to community. Those individuals are the individuals that then support Indigenous organizations, Indigenous businesses, and then uplift self-determination and strengthen community overall.
That's a great quote. I mean, education is a very powerful tool. What you described there is interesting because you very much describe a bottom up, so on the student support side, but also top down, training of the faculty and the professors. And I did just want to ask, one argument I have seen put forward is that actually co-opting Indigenous peoples into a Western tradition of university could be seen as yet another form of colonisation and imposing a certain culture. And you described that historically this is very much what universities were doing and subjugating the Indigenous knowledge that they carried. What's your answer to that? Do you see the solution lying within the changes you described within the universities themselves?
I do. So we have to understand that there's systems in place that take very long to make change and to kind of have that cultural shift. And there's some things I don't think that we will ever be able to change. But what we can do, and what we are looking at doing here at the university through the framework, is creating that space for Indigenous knowledges to be uplifted and recognized as equal, as a valid form of knowledge and education. And I guess if you're looking at it from a research perspective, I guess a way of creating knowledge itself. And so when you look at that, what are we doing here at the university? So we're really focusing right now on land-based education. So what does that mean? From a pedagogy perspective, we are creating space and tools so that we can use an Indigenous knowledge system to support everyone. So I think that's the other thing that we're transitioning here at the University of Manitoba. This is, yes, it's about uplifting and supporting and creating space for Indigenous students, that for how we work with Indigenous communities. But for me, it goes beyond that. How are we using that for everyone to show the benefits to everyone? And so looking at how does land-based education, the knowledge that we gain from the land, from the spiritual aspect, which I think is the hardest part in an academic setting, because we really like to divide. When I say spirituality, I think that sometimes from an academic knowledge creation perspective, we want to kind of keep that separate. But from an Indigenous perspective, that all is integral. You need to pull that all together. And so how do you allow for that space to happen in an academic setting and bring that forward to support everyone's mental health, to support knowledge creation for everyone, to support benefits and advancements in technology, in healthcare, in social services, from that basis of this knowledge supported communities and nations for centuries. And why not learn from that? Why not take the basis in particular from a sustainability perspective? Indigenous people looked at everything from a sustainability lens. That is huge right now. Why aren't we learning from that? And so I think it's creating the spaces for that, which we are doing here at the university. But one of the reasons we can do that is because we do have a high population of Indigenous communities in the province of Manitoba. So I think we're about 18% First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Our student population, we have about 3,000, just close to 3,000 Indigenous students that attend the University of Manitoba. And we have in the 70s, so about 74 faculty members and academics here as well. Yep. So we have a population base. We have the understanding, we have the knowledge base from the communities and our partners. So I think we have an opportunity to really show how an academic institution can do that. And we're moving that forward, both from a land base, but also from an Indigenous language perspective as well. So we are looking at how can we grow Indigenous language, because language is really the root. If we look at, for most of our understanding of worldviews and systems, language is a key part of that. So how are we uplifting our Indigenous languages here as well?
Yeah, it sounds like you're absolutely forging a path that would provide potential real valuable learning opportunities for others in this space. Now, you've talked there about the importance of bringing Indigenous knowledge systems into the university setting, into academia, centering it more in the teaching that's happening and how you're doing that. I think there are probably a lot of academics who do want to do this. I have read a lot of pieces written about the huge benefits that Indigenous knowledge can bring. I did wonder if you could offer any practical advice to an academic who does wish to bring more First Nations knowledge into their curriculum, into their teaching.
That's a great question. And I think it's one of the things that is critical when you're looking at actually meaningfully actioning reconciliation, because there is an onus on everyone. So we need to do this in partnership, which means it cannot be done and driven from an Indigenous perspective always. And we're seeing that. There are a lot of allies, there are a lot of supporters that want to really walk this path, that truly believe this. And I think that is critical in advancing these types of system changes. And so some of the things that I would say I think are critical is number one, partnerships. So number one, you need to have an understanding of the history from an Indigenous perspective. You need to understand what it means to be and what it's like. So who are your partners? Do you understand community? Do you have a partner, a community partner? Do you have elders, knowledge keepers that you work with? So it's starting to interact in my mind and build that network of relationship, because most of the Indigenous work is done through relationship. And to me, relationship builds trust. And trust is what you need when you want to truly do this in the right way and start incorporating it and getting the teachings from Indigenous people to be able to do that. So as an individual instructor, it's showing that you're doing the work. It's taking the understanding the history, taking the training that's out there. We've created at the university a wonderful document called Working in Good Ways. And it's a document that really is a framework and a resource to how to engage with Indigenous communities. I think that's the first step. It's looking at those principles of what it means to engage. It can take longer. So some of the, I think, challenges around that we find that people need to understand is relationship takes time. So you don't just have to have an idea of what research you want to do and you go out and find a community and yay, you'll partner and it'll all be great. I think that isn't the way you need to do it. You need to truly invest in community, and where we see success are with those researchers and academics that actually invest in those relationships. And sometimes that Indigenous community is the Indigenous community available to you here. So because we have such a large Indigenous community here at the University of Manitoba, it's investing in those relationships within your institution if you have those relationships. And if not, then it's looking at your partners outside. So I think I would just maybe add that in.
Yeah, it's a willingness to learn fundamentally, yes. and turn to those who actually know about this from a first-hand perspective, who live and breathe it. You've mentioned that researchers mentioned the fact that actually it's about building these relationships and that you need to put in the time to do that. And that brings us on to the final point I wanted to ask about, because I read a recent fairly harrowing news report really about a research project involving brainwave testing on Indigenous children, which has been criticised for questionable ethical conduct. It has called into question the sort of oversight system in Canada on research ethics, and that this is something that academia researchers have long been criticised for, kind of extractive research methods. Is there an issue around trust in academia in Canada, particularly potentially among marginalised communities? And if so, how can institutions and individuals go about tackling this?
Yeah, I took a look at the article as well, and it really made me question again, how is this happening again? So you're right, from an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous people do not trust the system. They are they were, and I think would still be, the most regulated nation or individual or population within Canada. So we still have acts and regulations targeted based on race, which is being status, Indian, which is now, creating, so Métis, we've had treaties, we have these relationships from a federal kind of perspective. And so when you are regulated like that, when you have to have, like, if we look at the Indian Act, as an individual who lived in an Indigenous community, you had to ask to leave. You had to ask to marry the person you wanted to marry. You did not have the right to vote until the 60s. Women, if you married or had a baby with somebody that was not considered a status Indian, you lost your status and got kicked out of your community. You were not able to run for leadership. So you have this population that did not have a lot of say or control over everyday activities, including you must send your children to residential schools. And in those residential schools, those children had no autonomy, no power to refuse or do anything. And we know there were experiments done within those schools. We know that there has been forced sterilization on Indigenous people in Canada here. So of course, when you come to research and ethics, why would you trust an institution to work with you? And so it does point to, the need to transform again that relationship, the power dynamic, in terms of understanding what are really the needs of the community. What does the community want to understand and learn and grow, and the knowledge that they want to create to improve the lives of their citizens, of their members? And how then do we, as an institution, academic or researcher, then help and support and lift that up through the ability of us to do these research projects? And so I think it's transitioning the dynamics so that there is control. So in Canada, we do have OCAP, so ownership, control, all of those things in terms of what does it mean for communities to set the priorities, for communities to drive a research agenda. And really, we then respond, which is not the way academic works, the academic world works at this point in time. And so it's, again, changing that system to understand that. And I think we're starting to see that from a government kind of funded research perspective and institution, but I still think there's so much further we need to go. And so looking here at the University of Manitoba, really looking at how are we looking at Indigenous ethics, and how are we ensuring that Indigenous lenses, so the people who are approving the ethics actually are coming from community or coming from those nations, and understand the questions to ask because they understand the realities, they understand the governance, they understand how community works and the needs of community and the impacts that research may have on community. So how are we expanding that and ensuring that that is considered within our REBs and within our research ethic approval processes? How are we supporting researchers? So similar to the Working in Good Ways, we're starting to look at how do we create a Researching in Good Ways tool and document to support researchers who want to work within communities and want to start that. So they actually have an understanding of how to do that, because part of it is nobody's ever talked about this. Nobody's ever, provided training on how to actually do this. And so I agree. I think researchers actually want to do good and feel like there's contributions that they can make to support communities, but how do you actually do that in a meaningful way that doesn't harm community, that lifts them up and allows them to drive that research agenda? And I think that it's training, and I think there's some pieces that we can do within that sphere of influence as well. So I think that really is kind of where we've been focused on. And I think there's more work that needs to happen, and we continue to see the advancements of that within academic institutions. But I think what we're going to start seeing is communities themselves are starting to demand that. Communities themselves are setting research protocols. So they are not allowing researchers to come in without creating that relationship, without having those dialogues and understanding. But obviously that article points to there is still weaknesses within the system that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. There is, as you point out, there's huge progress there. Of course, a huge amount of work still to do. But I think the fact that communities themselves are now looking to set the agenda that works for them, that has got to be a really positive step. And of course, with more Indigenous scholars coming up through the academic system, that is likely to have an impact as well, I presume.
We are absolutely seeing more Indigenous scholars come through the systems and starting to lead the research. So you're right. I think that changes the lens. I think there is still responsibilities for the institution to ensure that that research is being done in a good way, but that means understanding that from an institutional perspective. So it's not just about the researcher. I actually think it's about the institution as well. Yeah. And understanding what that means. And so to me, that's a key foundational piece that we at the University here of Manitoba need to address.
Yeah, as you said, this is everyone's work. And I think that's really important to remember. Look, Angie, thanks so much for talking to me today. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing such useful insight on this.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Chimigwich.
I learnt a huge amount speaking to Angie. I felt she really brought to life why there is such a big hill to climb for universities to rebuild relationships with Indigenous people in Canada. But equally, there was a lot there in what she shared in terms of the quite methodical steps that can be taken, you know, with an acknowledgement that this work will take a lot of time and a lot of effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the contexts between Canada and New Zealand are very different. As you were saying, First Nations people are incredibly different around the world. But listening to Angie, I did find some common themes of community and the strengths that Indigenous knowledges can bring to the academy. Te Kaweho Hoskins, who we'll hear from in a moment, is similarly engaged with community, and her research interests are Indigenous Maori political philosophy and practice, Indigenous settler relations and treaty practice. But I was very interested in hearing from her about how she got into academia and also what her role at the University of Auckland involves. Hi, Te Kaweho. It is fantastic to be speaking to you today for the Campus podcast.
Kia ora, Eliza, o tira tēnā tātou katoa e whakarongo mai nei ki tēnei kōrero. Kia ora, Eliza. This is Te Kaweho Hoskins talking to you from the Bay of Islands of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
How lovely. So you are the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Maori at the University of Auckland and an Associate Professor in Maori and Indigenous Education and Philosophy. And I wondered if you could elaborate a bit on that and tell the audience a bit about your role at the University of Auckland.
I came into the university as an adult student with a daughter, and having, you know, not really thought much about, you know, whether I was smart or I could do anything at university. But one thing I could do at school that I was told eventually, probably midway through secondary school, was that I could write essays. So I thought to myself, well, you know, that I think universities are the place you go when you can write essays. So I took myself off to university, and probably by then I'd become, you know, interested in you know, politics and the whole renaissance and revitalization of the Māori culture, the Māori world, Māori language, those sorts of things, and have already been quite deeply, I suppose, engaged in those things in different ways, and Māori education as well, because, you know, once you have children in that context, you realise, well, are they going to be able to be Māori speakers like I wasn't? Or am I going to dig in and make that effort to learn the language myself, which I had been learning from a relatively young age, and pass, you know, be able to pass that on. So all these sort of things led me to university in earnest at maybe around 30.
Yeah,
And
right.
I was working part-time and studying part-time, and then got through an undergraduate degree, did a master's degree, went to another tertiary institution, taught there for a couple of years, and thought, well, if I want to do a PhD, probably should come back to Auckland because it's the university, and so did that and ended up in Māori education. And I'm not a trained teacher. But in my other life outside university, I was deeply involved in these educational settings that were about revitalizing the language. So preschools, primary and secondary options where children were learning in Māori, but I was involved in those from a community and governance kind of aspect. So I ended up in Māori education because there was these amazing academics like Linda Tuhiwai Smith and Graham Smith and a range of others that had created the space, thinking about the sort of scholarly ideas and research that we were engaging with as students, that we sort of had the space to think about those through the lens of indigeneity, through the lens of Māori interests and Māori thinking, if you like. And so I ended up in education as a non-teaching academic, which was kind of a bit unusual. And and did that for it been so I think it's 20 years this year in the university, and today just was made a full professor. So that's
Congratulations.
that's news. That's good news. Yeah, and then as you do often in Māori, so I ended up in a Māori department, if you like, a school called Te Puna Wānanga, which was a school of Māori and Indigenous education, which was quite a small school that ran a Māori medium teacher education program. And then I ended up being the head of that department, and then started a bit of a trajectory into sort of Māori leadership roles in the university, in the faculty, and now in the centre of Auckland University, which I enjoy. Yeah.
And so, what does your role as Pro Vice Chancellor Maori involve?
Well, it's described as a sort of dimensional role. So if you think of all the portfolios of a university, which my understanding is they're quite similar. You've got, sort of people and culture and research and education and operations and so on. So my role and the role of my office is to work across all of those portfolios and to work with all of those leads to initiate and drive strategy and projects and initiatives to to do a range of things to better the experience of Māori students and staff, to better the positive engagement of the university with Māori communities, to look to the research development needs of the university, relationships of researchers with communities more generally, building Māori researcher capability and capacity, so all, you can imagine a range of projects. So it's quite diverse, and up until probably about 5 years ago, the role, which I think had been around from the early 90s, had been largely an advice and guidance role. So a single person with an EA or some kind of administrative support, sort of advising at the senior leadership team level. And the role has grown a lot in the last 3 or 4 years. So there's now a deputy role, and we've got a senior research lead, a senior kind of strategic lead, a senior Māori student cohort lead, and then a range of other staff who are involved in student facing activities. So I think we're about an office of 12 now from 2. And
Right.
so we're achieving a lot more for having that spread. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly some growth. Tell me a bit about the student makeup at Auckland. So what sort of percentage are Maori students there and staff as well?
Yeah, so we have about 6 to 7% Māori staff, professional and academic, about the same number.
Mm-hmm.
Māori are 17% of the population, so we're not anywhere near parity. And students are pegging around the same percentages. Yeah, so I mean, I think Māori student numbers are increasing. Māori staff numbers are increasing, but you have the difficulty of you get new staff in or you grow staff and then they go off and then you're kind of you're backfilling, or you have other changes in the university and you're having to preside over the loss of staff that you wouldn't otherwise have lost. So yeah, we've got a way to go. I mean, I think there's a lot of options for Māori students in New Zealand, and definitely a sense that perhaps a wrong sense, I'd argue, that other universities are more for them. And then also you might know we've got a wānanga system, so it's a particular tertiary education type unique to New Zealand called wānanga. And those are, if you like, Māori-led institutions. I mean, anybody can go to them, but they're obviously much more Māori in the way they, present and numbers of staff and numbers of students. So from the point of view of a kind of a belonging experience, those are often potentially preferred. And then Auckland is obviously a well-ranked university in the country. And so there's kind of ideas about are we elite and is this the place for us? And sometimes there's those sorts of barriers too. And probably actual barriers to entry into different programs that are not so high as at other universities. So these are all the things we know about ourselves as a university and the things that we're chipping away at, not just being interested in the Indigenous Māori and Pacific students that are the cream, if you like. They're already doing okay, and if they come to us, they'll do okay. We're interested in looking at what our long-term equity commitments are to growing a pipeline of Māori students from underserved communities that can also start to think about Auckland as a place for them, because we are the largest Polynesian city in the world. So we've got the largest Māori and Pacific population anywhere. And we want Auckland to be that an option for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. How far back or into the community are you able to, or do you need to reach back in order to shore up that pipeline?
Yeah, I think Auckland has utterly recognised in the last probably 4 or 5 years that it's not year 11 even, it's probably year 9, and it's probably earlier than that. So yes, I mean, a lot of this is about resourcing. So one of the projects, I mean, we've got teams that go out and engage with schools in different ways, and we've got a very active Pro-Vice Chancellor Pacific whose teams are very active and have various programs working in schools, sort of based around STEM, but also based around kind of a homework type of model where students can come in, from quite early on. And one of our teams in the university have initiated a very interesting project across about 15 schools in central Auckland, which is about the NCEA journey. And what we've discovered, which I think we have known, is that often, which is I'm not trying to diss schools, but often the pathways aren't clear for students, and the pathways aren't clear even for staff in schools about what credits, what choices students need to make at every point of their journey in order to be eligible for entry to certain programs at Auckland University. And so many students are getting to the end and finding, had some vague idea they wanted to do science or law or whatever, and aren't prepared. And so we're doing quite a substantial project in that space to just try and ensure at least that the best advice and encouragement is given to Māori and Pacific students to get along that trajectory, and from year 9. Yeah, I mean it's a huge ask, and universities are not funded to do the level of sort of deep relationship building and engagement that we need to do really to make the shift. So we're always thinking about how we can work, smarter and differently in order to kind of get some impact when you actually don't have enough people on the ground. I mean, you'll know that New Zealand universities have been underfunded for some time. That's pretty well known. So it's a difficult one, and we're always looking for philanthropic money to support, different projects and trying to, centre these groups of students on equity grounds and other grounds.
Yeah, that funding squeeze is a universal problem, I think. And when students get to university on campus, what sorts of things do Maori students need to help them succeed and thrive in higher education?
I mean, we have a range of, mechanisms by which we meet and greet and visibilise ourselves to Māori students at Auckland University. So they have a great orientation and a Māori specific one. We've got various other programs that invite students to come in the summer, Māori students come in the summer school period and have a really good orientation to the university, and to stay in accommodation, and to even achieve a course, achieve one paper while they're there, and give them a taste of university life. But if they don't do any of that and they just turn up, we are, there's a welcome for students. You mentioned the marae earlier. So that's I suppose, a cultural complex that is, that we try and ensure that all students have an opportunity to come through that gateway. That's the kind of model of the student engagement we've talked about as the porphyry, which is the ceremony of welcome. So, to conceptualize students coming into the university through that process of welcome, encounter, seeing the faces of people, showing generosity and care and hospitality towards them, and so on. So, I think that, I mean, there's lots of things. We've got a tuakana network program, which is in every faculty of the university. There are Māori student leaders and tutors that they can engage with, and network with other groups of students. We're just about to open a Māori student centre, like a standalone one we haven't had before. It's been much more distributed as part of campus life. We've got the Māori Student Association. We have Māori graduation ceremony. So students can graduate in the main ceremony, and they can have a more intimate ceremony on the marae and bring their families. And, it's generally a whole day, and really very uplifting to see families, present to see their students come through. They might still be first in family and so on. So I guess we're all, we're constantly about our offices constantly think about how do we remove barriers to success, and how do we make the university experience one where Māori students feel that they belong there. They can see themselves there, and of course part of that is are there enough Māori staff? So when I walk in, in some of my classes, am actually taught by Māori staff and professional staff, the people I engage with outside of the classroom. So these are just things that we work away at. We've got a learner success oversight group, so that's senior people across the university working with all the teams who are front face with students, and a range of initiatives to try and improve outcomes in courses. We've identified 20 critical courses, for example, that we can see patterns of students not doing well in those courses, and we've worked directly with those courses and in terms of teaching and learning, where their placement in the semester, their placement in the year, what our students might need. We're sort of doing curated pathways, offering those sorts of options for students. We say, if you think you might struggle here and there, if you head in this direction, you'll get where you want to go, but it'll be a structure of learning that will be advantageous to you. I mean, there's just heaps of things. I mean, we're probably not that big by Australian standards, but by New Zealand standards, we're a big organisation with a lot of students. So I think we're always grappling with how to make the place intimate, how to make relationships important, and to support students to think, I can actually speak to someone, I can actually reach out to someone. Everything isn't only and always online, I can come to know people, I can have a community or a range of communities on campus. And of course, like in other countries, just getting students back after COVID and trying to make on-campus experiences desirable and enjoyable has been a big part of the university's focus as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I have noticed, looking at the websites and things of New Zealand universities, that the Indigenous language is a very big part of the way that the university communicates with its students and the wider world. How does that tie into the embedding, or the embedding of the culture into the broader culture of the university? Because it feels like it's quite intrinsic to an outside view. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the Māori language was recognised, always was there, obviously, but was recognised via the Waitangi Tribunal process in 1987 as an official language of New Zealand. And, huge efforts have been made in Māori communities to revive the language as a living daily language for Māori communities. And we're doing well. We're not there, but we're doing well. But I think the formal political recognition meant that there was, national resources available to start to, develop Māori radio, Māori television, and to strengthen calls for the recognition and use and dual signage and all of that of Māori language in various institutions like schools, requirements on the compulsory schooling sector to make Māori language available to parents who ask for it, and to ensure that all students had access to Māori language and culture. So there's been a range of, community, policy, government responses, and I guess resourcing to drive the normalisation of Māori language in our country. I mean, these things remain political because the current government, sort of told various departments of the state to not remove the Māori language, the Māori name of their, but to foreground the English name.
Right.
So so these things remain political, but I think you're right in the sense that these things are intrinsic and embedded because this has been a 40-year concerted effort, and many New Zealanders learn the language, take opportunities to learn the language, to go to night classes. These have been able to be offered free by some of the institutions over many years, and I'd be so thrilled to go visit classes and see, our Asian communities and all sorts of other communities getting along and learning Māori. We used to think about this as kind of window dressing at a level, oh, we can have Māori signage here and there or a Māori name, but beneath that, maybe there wasn't much else. And I think we feel a lot less like that now. We feel that at all levels of university life, including our narratives and our identity and the way we present ourselves publicly, that we have a positive embrace of language and culture. For the enjoyment of all too. I think that's one thing that's often forgotten, that actually New Zealanders in large numbers really enjoy having an Indigenous culture to engage with, be part of, to understand, and to speak that language too.
I wanted to ask, as a final question, what is it about the Maori community on campus that enriches the experience? You've seen things evolve as well to become much more embedded, and what benefits has that brought along with it?
Well, we've talked about this project, I suppose I'd call it, as indigenisation, and we've had mostly good responses to that idea. And then in the current climate, a bit of pushback on that, because I guess, I mean, any of those isation words, I myself, I'm not like enamored with them, but it's kind of an idea that captures a lot of ideas, in one word. And I think they always need to be unpacked and discussed. What do we actually mean by this? And I think coming from an Indigenous point of view, this is centrally about relationships. This is the core of it, the core of anything, the core of any possibility for productive outcomes in any way is on relationships. So this is I guess we see this very much as a process and not an end point, because relationships take time to build, and they need to be maintained, and they are in small ways and big ways. They're in the day-to-day moments of encounter, and they're in larger, if you like, structural arrangements and agreements. But for us, that's the core. And so we don't have a grand vision of what we're necessarily trying to achieve, other than, had the Māori relationship with the outside world via the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 proceeded differently, we would have institutions like universities where Māori people and knowledge and ways of being and so on would have been at the foundation of these institutions, because we were very interested in these institutions. We weren't just, we welcomed these institutions in. We asked for the first school to come to New Zealand. It was Māori leaders in the far north who asked Samuel Marsden to bring a teacher and establish a school here. We wanted this engagement with the outside world. So had things proceeded differently, these would be places where people were completely comfortable. They felt they belonged. They were institutions for them too. And so when you say that, you would like to think about an institution like a university, like the University of Auckland being Indigenous, isn't to say that it's an Indigenous institution and that's all it is. But for Indigenous communities, it's Indigenous. And for other communities who want to enjoy that, they can enjoy that, but it's also the type of university they want and need, and so on. It's not a zero-sum game of, if we are involved in indigenising processes, it's necessarily exclusionary for others. But, so how does it look and feel? People have access to Māori knowledge called mātauranga. So, universities don't want to claim that we own mātauranga or, but we are a site in which mātauranga can also be produced and cared for, which isn't, where communities are sites of production and care of Māori knowledge. But we have Māori researchers involved in working with Māori knowledge in a range of ways. And so the university should be a place that practice can thrive, and mātauranga can be engaging with other knowledge systems in productive and exciting ways, and it does. That this could be more. So we do want these things to be beyond the superficial of culture, but we also want people to sort of be able to enjoy culture too. Maybe one last thing I can say is something we started that exemplifies this a couple of years ago is a ceremony called kawe aroha, which means to convey or share love. Aroha is love. And we have that ceremony around the middle of the year when the Māori New Year occurs. You might know that we've got a new public holiday in New Zealand which celebrates the Māori New Year, the Southern Hemisphere's
I
New
didn't
Year.
know that.
Makes more sense, yeah. So the last Labour government under Jacinda Ardern. And so that holiday changes from year to year, what date it will be, because it depends on when the constellation, Matariki constellation, reappears in the sky. And so the experts tell the government, this should be your date. So no one knows from year to year when that public holiday will be. But one of the things that happens in that ceremony is that we remember, because it's a new year, we remember the people who have passed before. We remember the people who have passed in the year before or in the years before. So we created a ceremony inside our traditional meeting house at the University of Auckland, where any university staff member can bring the memory of their loved one into that house and have them acknowledged and celebrated. And that has been incredibly powerful because Māori will come, but lots and lots of non-Māori will come and bring the image and a citation of their mother, and we have it up on a screen and someone reads it. And it's incredibly, because what it does is it's saying, we care about you as a whole person, not just about, your productivity in the university and leave your personal life behind, but, you are a whole being. And so these things are powerful for Māori and non-Māori alike, and they shift things in profound ways. When we talk about values-led culture and, all these sort of things that the HR part of our universities promote, well, this is something, no one asked us to do this. Is something that we came up with, the team came up with, and it's, so these are the things. These are the things I think that can really shift the culture of workplaces in positive ways that for all.
That's a profound note to finish on, I think. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you today for the podcast, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliza. Lovely to meet you and to engage in this. Kia ora tātou.
So I found this interview really illuminating and also profoundly moving with the descriptions of the shared space that Te Kawe spoke about at the end, and also the role of language. One of the things that has often struck me looking at websites, for example, from the New Zealand universities, Auckland is not alone in this, and also the New Zealand government, is the priority given to space for the Maori language. And the Maori language and outreach programs are extending into schools and out into the community to really bring people in. As she says, it's not a zero-sum game. gains and space for Indigenous knowledge doesn't mean that there's less knowledge and less space for more conventional teaching, learning and research.
No, that's such a salient point to make. It is interesting. I mean, as you said, while there's a huge range of different issues at stake here, there are some universals, language being one of them, but another one is this need for universities to really help build a sense of belonging within their institutions, or facilitate a sense of belonging. Now, we have, as Eliza mentioned at the start, we have a special spotlight guide, Indigenous Voices in Higher Education, on campus, where you can find loads of insight from Indigenous scholars and their colleagues around the world on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge into curricula or student support initiatives, leadership, and much more. Go to www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and we will be back in a few weeks' time. I hope you will have a wonderful festive period.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.